Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Community Solar. Today's webinar will run for 3¼ hours, which will include a 15-minute break around the hour-and-a-half mark. We'll try to stick to the breaking points as closely as possible, but we may run a few minutes before or after. We do have a few notes to go through before we begin. First, as a means to prove attendance in the event that either you or Half Moon Education is audited by any licensing board, please be sure you are logged into the webinar using your own individual internet connection. As an extension of reporting accurate attendance, there will be a brief quiz at the conclusion of today's webinar. If you are unable to complete this quiz after today's webinar, you can access it via a follow-up email that will be sent approximately 1 hour after the webinar ends. Everyone will receive this email, so if you have already completed the quiz, you can disregard it. Certificates of completion will be issued for each webinar attended. The certificates will be sent via email within 5 business days and after a quiz has been successfully submitted. If you need your certificate sooner for relicensing purposes, you can either call into our office or reply to any of the emails that you have received regarding this webinar. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar. If you have a question, you can ask your question in the questions area of the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. It may take us a minute to get to each question, but we will answer all. Materials for today's webinar were emailed this morning. If you weren't able to receive the materials, you can access them in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your computer screen. The documents will open in your default internet browser where you can view or print them. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. John Ross Cromer, Master Electrician, Mechanical Engineer, and Certified Photovoltaic Installation Professional. Take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Community Solar program. I just want to start out on a kind of an off-topic discussion. We'll only spend a minute on it. But sometimes in my solar programs, I'm a little tough on utilities. I'm pro distributed power, and I'm not, I'd rather see more distributed power than centralized power. But I do have to say, one of the things, I grew up in Houston, Texas, so it's kind of underwater right now. So I wrote a quick blog post about, what's going on in Houston. And the most amazing thing is that by and large the power has stayed on in Houston. So while there's tremendous flooding, a lot of the chaos from Hurricane Sandy was because the Northeast coast lost power for a week and a half or more for most of like New York City and New Jersey. But now they have power on, and the reason why the power has stayed on is because Houston over the last 15 years or so has been hit by a series of major storms. There was Tropical Storm Allison, which was the most damaging storm up until Katrina, and then there was also Gustav and Ike in rapid succession. And Ike was pretty bad for Houston as well. And so a lot of the rebuild that had been done, utilities are more likely to trim their trees. Some of the distributed power stations that were located in basements were relocated to above ground. And so, that is a great job that CenterPoint Energy has done over the last 15 years to make the grid more resilient during an emergency, and that's certainly paying off right now. So, in my programs, I generally am a little more anti-utility and pro-consumer in my solar advocacy, but I feel like I have to give credit where credit is due, and CenterPoint is doing a great job. And I've even heard that it's really not chaotic when they're going out and getting the power restored, because they don't have they don't have to figure out what to do. They're a couple of steps ahead in that game. Okay, so today we're going to talk about community solar, and one of the goals of this program is to understand green energy transactions and how they work, and also why they work. You might find that there are buyers of renewable energy that will voluntarily increase their electric bill to support renewable energy. And that's kind of a little counterintuitive because most people are not like that. We'll also find that to if you want to like roll up your sleeves and dive into the green energy transaction market, you can actually sign up your business for a green power plan almost without changing your electric bill at all because the carbon credits which track these transactions are subject to price manipulation. So we're gonna talk about that. And I'm not a big fan of voluntary green energy transactions for reasons that that we'll get into. But community solar is a little bit different in that it's more transparent and there's less of a attempt to kind of hoodwink the purchasers. And instead, it's based off of mutual understanding and disclosure. So it's a stronger product than other kinds of voluntary green energy transactions, and it has value for the utility as well. And so a lot of utilities are interested in saying, well, if we're going to lose market share to solar, why don't we try and own the process and do that through utility scale solar development, but that's not necessarily consumer oriented. And so you'll add a community layer on top of any utility scale project in order to not only increase the project profitability, but also to let consumers feel like they're involved in this green energy transition. Um, so it's just a good thing for utilities to learn all around. That said, nothing's preventing you from starting your own community solar program in the private market, and we'll talk about what you need to know to get into that. So this is not going to cover too much solar product technology like our other programs. This is kind of more for managers and developers, perhaps a few dreamers. But just remember that Half Moon is the continuing education provider for the program. And if you want to follow up with me, I've given you my personal Gmail in the chat box. Just send me a Gmail. We'll get you set up with course recording access. My website is www.community.solar. Feel free to check that out after class. You probably know me by now. I think I've seen the attendance list and the names look pretty familiar. So we'll dispense with the intro and just dive right in. Okay, so the Solar Energy Industries Association is probably the largest .org in the solar industry. They're kind of large company, large stakeholder oriented. So manufacturers, trade groups, they're all SEIA members, and they've defined community solar as any shared arrangement allowing multiple electric customers to combine investments and provide power and or financial benefit from one solar array. And I think the most important word in all of this is this and or right here, because what that means is some participants in community solar may not receive the renewable power. And it might be that they receive the financial benefit instead. And some participants may receive financial benefits, but not the renewable power. And so you'll find community solar subscribers who sign up for a community solar array, but legally they cannot claim to be powered by the green energy because that claim is being sold off to a third party. And that might sound a little odd, but just keep that in mind, is that the participants in community solar don't necessarily receive financial benefit for participating. They don't necessarily receive the green power for participating. But at the end of the day, it's a business model to develop local green power plants. And we're seeing success in that market. There's growth in that market. Um, it's a little hard to understand community solar because every state's electric policy across the country is different. And that means every community solar project across the country is going to have its own regional flavor. And so, so what we're going to try and do is understand how policy is implemented in both regulated and deregulated grid structures, and see how community solar might play out in either of those markets. Now, what this graph indicates is that we have states that have community solar projects on the left, and then we have states that have community solar legislation on the right. And what we can see is that by and large we have state policy driving community solar projects, but then again there are community solar projects throughout the country and regions that might not have any state laws mandating it, or if not mandating it, providing the framework by which it occurs. And so what that indicates is there are electric cooperatives and larger utilities, and maybe even some voluntary projects and groups out there as well, putting together community solar on their own, absent any kind of political motive. So they say, we think this is a good idea, let's get together and do it. And while policy is a driver of community solar projects, so we see Washington passes some policy and then they implement a project, and then Massachusetts passes some policy, and then a few years later they implement a project. Maine passes a policy, and maybe now they've implemented a project. But then there are a couple of states that, like Colorado, that get ahead of the curve. And so why might a utility implement community solar before or ahead of a state mandate? Well, at that point, they'll have a lot of input to provide the Public Utility Commission. And so they, by implementing community solar successfully ahead of a state law or framework, you might have a larger seat at the table to make sure that it's your model that is becomes kind of a standard in that region. Now, this is one reason why community solar was so popular, like, a year ago. It was all community solar, community solar, community solar. It all has to do with that tax credit. Community solar offers a little bit more value than non-community solar, and the reason is you still get that local distributed power feeling, but you also have economies of scale from a utility scale project. And so just from that alone, imagine you get a knock on the door and it's a solar installer, and he wants to put a solar array on your rooftop and sell it to you, and you're going to save money for however long, 25 years. And instead, the utility knocks on your door and says, well, we want to match that guy's price and match the same savings, but we want to do the array instead of the solar guy, and we're going to build it outside of town, and you won't get to keep whatever is left after 25 years, but at the same time, you won't have to maintain the array either. A lot of homeowners would give that some fair and valid consideration. And the reason why the utility might do that is they make the profit off of the install instead of the installer. So if they're going to lose market to solar, they might as well be the ones making the construction profit off it at the very least. At the same time, in 2016, everyone thought that the federal tax credit was going to expire, and instead it got extended. So, this graph was what the industry thought would happen in 2015. They thought the tax credit would expire, and they thought that that alone was going to level off the amount of residential solar being installed. At the same time, community solar business models are coming to market. And so in 2015, the industry thought was that community solar was going to be the next big thing in the solar industry. And instead, the tax credit was extended. I think that the buzz around community solar has gone down a little bit, but we are seeing more subsidies and expire, and more import tariffs, potentially raising the cost of solar. Regardless, if we understand the value of community solar, then maybe we can see some implementation, uh, regardless of what policy is driving or not. Uh, so there's other ways to be involved in green energy transactions in your community: green power purchasing, Groupons, direct ownership. What green energy transactions essentially boil down to is that there is no way to directly connect the electron from the windmill to whoever is buying it. And in fact, even tracking electrons doesn't make sense. But even tracking the kilowatt hours is difficult. We have the meter coming out of the windmill, and we have the meter going in to the point of business, but what happens to that electricity in the middle? On a shared grid, it gets all muddled up. So you really can't, sell a green energy plan and say, like, we guarantee that the electricity from that windmill is actually hitting that point of business. And this is not just true for green energy. This is true for all, electric transactions. So, electric transactions are kind of like a stock market where, you have buyers and sellers, and then the stocks get traded on this exchange in kind of a frenetic process. And so the fact that there's a virtual transaction between buyer and seller that doesn't actually have to do with the electrons themselves, but just has the green value of the electricity that's being bought and sold in a virtual process, it may offend common sense, because they're just making things up and it's not really doing anything, is a common attack of, like, carbon credit markets and stuff like that. But the renewable energy credit, or the renewable energy certificate, is what is commonly used in the United States instead of carbon credits. And the reason why a renewable energy credit is so much more valuable is that it's quantifiable. You can meter it. You can put your utility meter, the same meter that buys and sells electricity, on a solar array and track all of the energy that comes out of it. And a renewable energy credit is created by simply having a green power generator and documenting the electricity that comes out of it. And so that's where people, I think, get the most confused about RECs, as they say, well, do I have to go to a state exchange, or how do I create a REC, or what is the deal with RECs? You create a REC by generating green electricity and documenting the production. And maybe the utility has given you a rebate for your solar array that's not really a rebate. Maybe they're purchasing the REC rights to the system in exchange for that rebate. Maybe there's a utility production incentive. I know in Mississippi, in order to not get avoided cost backflow purchase, but instead to get instead of getting 1/3 the value of electricity for outflow, the power company purchases outflow at 2/3 its value and forces the homeowner to give up all the RECs for the system in exchange for that. So it's actually one of the worst policies in the United States, but whatever. All utilities are rallying behind renewable energy credits because they're much more quantifiable than the carbon credit that was more popular in like the 80s and 90s. Um, so whenever you have a state level exchange for renewable energy credits or a state level mandate for utilities to purchase renewable energy credits, the state will run an exchange that establishes rules. And if your array follows those rules, you can register your RECs with the state. If your RECs don't follow those rules, you can't sell them to state utilities, but you might be able to sell them on the voluntary market to someone else. So, what we were just talking about is our electric grid is, a big tangle of wires, and essentially we got, power plants feeding into a high voltage grid, and that electron is flowing down into lower and lower voltage distribution networks, almost like the top of a boulder rolling all the way down the mountain. We have electrons stepping down from this high voltage into this low voltage, and they don't even know where the electricity is going to flow to the nearest load, and if that load is fully met, the electricity is going to flow to the next nearest load. And so, not only are RECs virtual transactions, but energy tracking and sales is this kind of like, well, we know how much energy in, we know how much energy out, but we're not counting everything that's mixed in together. And for that matter, how all of this works is that you might just have a regulated electric company that does everything. They maintain the power lines, they maintain the distribution lines, transmission. They might own the generating resources, or they just contract with the power generators directly, and they send everyone an electric bill at the end of the month. So it's one company that does everything, and so they don't really need to track energy in and energy out. They just have to manage their finances appropriately. And so a regulated grid, it's actually, very streamlined and very clear what the policies are and what the policies aren't. It's very, I don't know, everyone gets the same electric bill. Uh, it's very powerful. These are basically monopolies, and the way that they're checked and balanced is that there's a public utility commission, and maybe the public utility commission is there to say, okay, in exchange for that monopoly, you have to make sure you give these customers certain rights. And so it might be that the Public Utility Commission passes a state net metering law or a community solar law, or framework to allow community solar projects to happen, and the utility goes along with it because they want to retain that right to a monopoly. The problem is in some states, the Public Utility Commission is not really looking out for consumer rights. They're looking out for the power company's rights, and there may be valid reasons for that. Um, but you will get states that don't have any kind of net metering laws, that have very punitive policies against solar customers on regulated grids. And essentially, those solar customers have to, go and lobby the Public Utility Commission to deregulate the power company in order to overcome a anti-solar regulated utility. And I would argue that if you are a regulated utility, and you have your reasons to be regulated, and there is absolutely value in having a streamlined, straightforward electric policy, you run the risk of being deregulated if you come down too hard on distributed solar customers. I mean, energy independence is not just a national issue, it's a personal one as well. And if you start ticking off your wealthier, energy independence crowds, you actually might start seeing protests at your door. It may be easier just to implement some solar friendly policy and work together rather than apart. Now, this is what happens on a deregulated grid. On a deregulated grid, this is Texas's business model, where they say every unique component of the grid has to be managed by a separate entity. So your power generators cannot be the ones who sell the electricity to the customer. The local grid distributor is not the one who does the transmission lines for the entire state. And in fact, the way that say in Houston, Texas, speaking of Houston, there's this retail electric provider market where you might have, 40 different companies trying to sell you electricity. And the idea is that competition helps keep the price of electricity low. But there's only so much these retail electric providers can do because they still have to pay the distribution and transmission fees. I guess what it does is it forces the risk of bankruptcy onto these retail electric providers. And you also see retail electric providers being very innovative with their billing structures. So for example, in Houston, you can find a retail electric provider that offers a net metering plan to their customers, even though there's no state law that mandates net metering. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's because solar customers, not all of them generate 100% of their bill. And so the retail electric provider is competing for the remaining 50% of their bill, or even just the meter fee on their bill. And so, I think that's pretty amazing that there are regulated grids out there that do not provide net metering to their customers, but on a deregulated grid, the free market is showing that at least some compromise on net metering is economically viable for someone who's actually competing for their business. And I think that makes a strong argument for deregulation of regulated utilities who do not have solar friendly policy. But anyway, on a deregulated market, the chaos is that you might have long-term power contracts to say, okay, I'm buying this much power from that power plant, and this is what it's going to look like for the next year or 2 or 3 or 10, whatever. But then we have the weather. And so if we can tell it's going to be a hot day versus a cold day, we know we might need more power or less power. And so in addition to your long-term contracts, there's a day-ahead market that says, look, if you're not contracted for enough power, you're going to need to buy some to supply your customers. And so there's a separate day-ahead market based on what the weather is going to look like. But then there's the actual day of. In the actual day of, maybe the heat wave didn't matter, and so you overbought. Or maybe the heat wave did matter and you didn't buy enough, and what happens then? Well, the faucets stay open. The customer still gets the power. They don't lose their power because their retail electric provider didn't contract enough. But there's a penalty process where the suppliers of energy who supplied the grid but didn't get paid for it receive penalties that the vendors who contracted for those customers, they didn't buy enough, and there's a reconciliation process between the generators and the retail electric providers. So this is something that if you wanted to build a utility scale solar farm in, say, Texas, you would have to deal with. But because it's a deregulated grid, you might have a smoother process of actually buying some land near some transmission lines, building the project and connecting it. But you would have to go and find all these customers out there to buy your electricity, and you'd have to find a retail electric provider to work with you. So in a sense, it's easier to develop projects in a deregulated market, but finding the purchasers is hard, and also you need a lot of knowledge. Whereas on a regulated grid, it's more like the TVA that says, we'll buy all solar electricity at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, but you have to figure out how to make the project work. And if it can make, plug it in, and we'll purchase it from you. It's a more streamlined process, but it's also a more rigid process. So here's Reliant Energy in Texas, and they have a very flexible rate structure. This is a free weekends plan where you have free electricity during the weekend and a higher rate during the week. Well, that's not particularly useful for solar. Well, they also have this solar sellback plan that is what they're calling a net metering plan. It's actually just, it's more like getting 2/3 the value of the electricity, but keeping your renewable energy credits. There's a few providers, and you have to know which one has the best net metering program. Steering the conversation back towards community solar, monitoring becomes important. I talked with one community solar program in Virginia, and I was asking them about, well, what did they do with the renewable energy credits that the system provided? And they said they didn't know. They didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how. They're like, we would give them to our customers, but we don't know how to give renewable energy credits to our customers. But this isn't the same program. But on the community solar participants electric bill, here is Nevada Power, and they're showing a green energy rider for the electrical consumption for the month, and they're adding a 4 cent a kilowatt hour charge to this customer's bill because they're purchasing the green energy rider. This is effectively Nevada Power transferring 1,036 kilowatt hours of renewable energy credit to the customer. And the reason is, remember, with a renewable energy credit, it's really just about tracking and documentation. And this is a document that this customer purchased this much renewable energy credit from the power company. And legally, that would entitle the customer to go out there and tell the whole world that they purchase renewable energy because they have a receipt that shows that they've done it. And so that the how you track is important because you want to generate that receipt so you can show your generation and you can show a receipt of who you sold the renewable energy to. Now, does that have to be a utility meter? No. Often it's done through your inverter meter. Now, your solar inverter meter may only be 95% accurate, and the utility scale meter is 98 to 99.5% accurate. So there's this misnomer in the industry that says, oh, you have to do a utility scale meter to do RECs because it's more accurate than the inverter software. And that's not true. In fact, some inverter softwares will even provide a more accurate utility grade meter that is a higher accuracy meter for reporting to the state. But usually, if the utility was requiring a utility meter, That's simply because they want to collect all of the information in the same manner. So they don't, when they don't want to have a separate way to collect the solar data than there is from the electric meter. So they're rolling trucks through your community and picking up the wireless signal from the meters to read your production data, and they don't want to have to use different technology to extract that data for their specific solar programs. So often when you participate in a utility driven solar program, you're asked to put an additional meter onto the solar array, but it's more about data collection, not necessarily about the accuracy of that data. In fact, speaking of accuracy, if you get into the brass tacks, it might be a little eye-opening, because here in Washington, D.C., which has a renewable energy credit market, if your solar array is less than 10 kilowatts, you can claim renewable energy credits simply based on a PV watts printout. So you don't need a revenue grade meter. You can just go to PV Watts and do a PV Watts calculation, which is a little bit ridiculous, but they're using basically the honor system for systems that are small. And assumably, if you're fraudulent, you claim too much, and if you're claiming more than everyone else in this category, you're going to stick out. Uh, and presumably, there's an auditing process where you might get randomly audited, and to keep everyone honest. Um, Delaware, it's completely different. You have to have a revenue grade meter. Um, Massachusetts, it's you want the revenue grade meter. Maryland is again PV watts. Let's see, New Hampshire, revenue grade, New Jersey, PV watts. New Jersey and DC have, robust renewable energy credit markets. So, it's the point is every state renewable energy credit exchange has their own rules, and the collection of the data is not always about accuracy. It's just more about abiding by whatever rules have stuck on that utility exchange. And a lot of utilities have exchanges. So where do you go to actually participate in these exchanges? In DC, the renewable energy credits can be worth more than the retail price of electricity. So in DC, and New Jersey, and Massachusetts, solar power generates at over twice its value, because you're not only saving on the energy, you're also selling the renewable energy credit for, a whole lot. In most states, the renewable energy credits are worth only 10 to 20% of the price of electricity, or if they have any value at all. And then in the bulk majority of states, there is very little market for renewable energy credits. Not that they don't exist, it's just that they're difficult to monetize outside of a state market, except if you're a utility. If you're a utility, you have a customer relationship. And there are customers out there who want to buy renewable energy. So if you go into your utility website and you research their rate structures, you go into prices and rates, you will find green power plans offered for most utilities. And so looking at Alabama Power's green power plan, we see that going into the brass tacks, we see the amount billed for our renewable energy credit purchase is $1.25 a month for 12 months. That turns out to be $15 per renewable energy credit. And renewable energy credits are often quantified in 1,000 kilowatt hour chunks. And so if you have a $15 renewable energy credit, You divide by 1,000, and that comes out to be a penny and a half a kilowatt hour. So in Alabama Power, their price of electricity is about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. The renewable energy, let me fix my mic, it fell over. The renewable energy credit is worth about 15% the price of electricity. Then you go to a different website, Indianapolis Power and Light, and you look up the price of their renewable energy credits. And, so you go to the website, you go into the rate structures, you find residential rates, you go to the Green Power Initiative, and you say, okay, this rate applies to residential service and all these other services too. And you go and you read the brass tacks of it. It's a standard contract rider for green power. Customers can voluntarily purchase 25%, 50%, or 100% of their electricity, and the purchase rate is a tenth of a penny a kilowatt hour. And so here we have company A selling renewable energy credits for a penny and a half, and company B selling renewable energy credits for a tenth of a penny. Oh, why is there a huge price difference? There's also an issue with the way renewable energy credits are tracked and sold. There is a standard in the industry, and it's put out by Green E, and it's a voluntary standard. And not all state exchanges abide by the Green E voluntary standard. So some state exchanges will allow you to store renewable energy credits and contract for renewable energy credits on into the future and on into the past. So the shelf life might be different than the Green E platform. Whenever there's a federal requirement for federal buildings or a prestigious voluntary requirement, like for the U.S. Green Building Council, it's not that the RECs necessarily have to be certified by Green E, but they have what's called the Green E national standard, and it governs the rules and regs governing Green E certified RECs and sets a standard for other voluntary green energy transactions. And the most important part of the Green E standard is somewhat of an honor pledge against double counting. And so specifically, double counting, examples of double counting might be when the renewable energy credit is bought and sold to more than one party. That's pretty obvious. You can't double sell. You can't commit fraud. That's not what renewable energy is about. That's not what life is about. But it's more murky than that, because double counting is also when a renewable energy credit is claimed by more than one party, and a claim could be claiming from not just environmental disclosure requirements, but also for the purposes of marketing. And so if I'm marketing to you as being, sign up for my green energy plan, but I'm selling that renewable energy credit to a third party, that's considered double counting on most green energy transaction markets, especially at the voluntary level. And even more explicitly, when the REC is used by a utility to meet a mandate and is also used to satisfy customer sales, that would be considered double counting. And most community solar platforms violate this standard. They sell the renewable energy credit to the utility, but they also market to the participant as it being, community solar. And so you really have to educate the customer when they're signing up for your platform that they are not buying this renewable energy credit. And for them to commit to that, they have to understand that what that means is that the utility will be counting the environmental mandate for their voluntary participation. And when in the solar industry, when you have utilities providing rebates to solar customers, they may actually have to sign a document that says, I understand what's going on. If I participate in my utility's solar incentive, I cannot claim to be solar powered. They give you a list of things you can say, but you cannot explicitly say that your building or your home is solar powered if you've sold those renewable energy credits to a third party. Now, what's the price point of these renewable energy credits? Well, it's all over the board. We saw in Nevada Power, some customers are willing to pay 4 cents a kilowatt hour, both at the residential and non-residential level. But then again, if we get a price point that's like Indianapolis Power and Light, where it's all the way down at a tenth of a penny, we're going to see, heavy purchase volumes of RECs. Well, then again, there's this outlier right here where they're buying tons of RECs for, not a tenth of a penny, but a penny and a half. And so there's also, particularly in commercial sales, a little bit less education in the market, where this customer might save 90% by going and shopping for their RECs out a little bit more aggressively. And so this is where RECs get really kind of disgusting, actually. This is the national price of renewable energy credits. And not just in the past year or two, but in the past few years, there's been a surge in renewable energy. And often the amount of renewable energy generated in a particular state exceeds the state mandated requirements. So now there's too many renewable energy credits on the market that don't have any buyers. And so once you meet all of your, annual obligations for the RECs, you have a bunch of RECs left over and they're essentially worthless. And so what do you do with them? Well, the answer is you go and you sell them to the voluntary market. And, for customers, if you're a utility that has a whole bunch of worthless RECs, you can go and sell them to voluntary customers and make a killing. Voluntary renewable energy could be one of the most profitable, products that a utility has to sell to a customer. But effectively, what happens when a utility can buy a renewable energy credit for a tenth of a penny and then sell it for, 2 cents a kilowatt hour? We see that Indianapolis Power and Light is offering it at its cost. That's probably the best utility green energy power plan in the country. Most utilities don't follow Indianapolis Power and Light's lead. Most utilities go in and sell a higher priced REC. And what that can mean is that for every dollar that a voluntary customer is putting into renewable energy, maybe only 5 cents is going to the project site and 95 cents is going into the utility's bottom line. And so you have to ask yourself, oh, what good is this? Because if I'm a voluntary customer and I find out that 95% of my purchase is actually going to fund, baseload operation of fossil fuels and not going to incentivize renewable energy, I'm going to be ticked off. So, anyway, that's kind of one of our goals is to help drive better business market models to market. And so what we've done in the next part of class is we're going to go through a few case studies and dissect the renewable energy programs and see, how these policies, the renewable energy credits, long-term contracts, regulated and deregulated structures, we're going to go into each program and figure out how they've navigated these waters to try and find what a good framework is for a community solar program. The first one on the block, sorry, the first one on the block kind of sticks out. This community solar project actually never got off the ground. It stalled out in a ethics committee panel. The vote was 2-2, and so a tie did not go to the proposal. It was actually the reason why this community solar project stalled. And keep in mind that Alabama is a state that does not have net metering. It turned out that the landowner who wanted to lease the land to the community solar project was one of the state's public utility commissioners. So he was he was profiting off of, or he was trying to profit off the community solar project, but his own constituents could not have access to solar. So that did not, at the very least, that half of the ethics committee thought that could be a conflict of interest. Then again, on the same, just north on the Tennessee Valley Authority grid, you have an electric cooperative that sizes up the TVA's program and says, you know what, we can actually make a project work under the feed-in rate that the TVA was offering. And they felt that in order for the cooperative members to go along with it, it would be a good idea to allow everyone to buy into the project. And so they actually applied and got the power purchase agreement from the TVA ahead of having any clue what their community solar platform would look like. And so all they knew going into the process was we have a good purchase rate with our utility. We're going to get the framework in place to do a 1 megawatt project. They even brought in an investor who underwrote the project and would hold the contract if they didn't get enough community buy-in members. And they built the whole array without any clue of what their community solar platform would be. They just knew going into it that they would do community solar. Minnesota has, and we're going to explore more dollars and cents with some case studies towards the end of this list. Geronimo Solar is a developer of community solar in Minnesota. And so this was a headline, 66 megawatts of community solar sold to Berkshire Hathaway. So they developed 66 megawatts of community solar over 21 locations. And so that turns out to be about 3 megawatts per location. Expected to be constructed by the end of 2017. And so you go to their website, and it says a few things. There's no upfront investment, and you get annual energy savings. So it sounds like that's a pretty good deal. No investment, annual savings. Enjoy the security of Berkshire Hathaway. And that's absolutely true. I mean, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the securitization of solar is not the greatest. And, so if you're signing up for a 20-year community solar membership, having a strong financial backer on the project will give you a lot more security than if it's just a private organization doing it. And so that's a big competitive advantage that utilities have, is that they have that strong financial, maybe if you're in the utility, your finances are causing you to gray your hair prematurely, but for your average consumer, they look at a utility as being a stable long-term institution as composed to a startup. Support renewable energy and increase brand loyalty and overall value. So what we can see is they're being very vague about their environmental claims. They're telling you that you're supporting renewable energy, but they're not telling you to buy renewable energy. And they're saying that, hey, there's marketing value here, but they're not telling you that you can go out and tell the community that you're solar powered. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, a little bit. And if you have to know how to stay on the right side of that fence, because you're not transferring the wreck in most cases. Then again, no maintenance or overhead. You don't, someone else takes care of it, which is another reason why you need a strong financial powerhouse. And then for the second time, they mention again, you have a strong financer backing the project. So they're stressing that is a good thing. But they didn't have any program details on their website. They didn't have how much it cost, what those annual savings were. So I called them up and I asked them, and then I got an email shortly thereafter from their director of marketing, who essentially told me that he wasn't going to answer any of my questions because of the information being commercially sensitive. Well, they're getting someone is getting a 30% tax credit at the federal level on this project. So I would hope that they would be a little bit more transparent in, how much it costs someone to participate in their program. Evidently their VP of business development disagreed with me, because right after I got the email from the director of marketing, their VP of business development said, all of their community solar agreements are individually negotiated and bound by confidentiality agreements. So, they weren't able to talk about any of their pricing out of respect for their customers. Okay, well, I just hopped online to a message board and I tracked down someone who answered my questions. But why don't we go and explore Minnesota's policy laws to understand how the community solar projects in Minnesota are playing out? This is a different program in Minnesota, and the main thing I wanted to point out on this is that SunShare, I guess they're a little bit more open with their contracts. It's a 25-year contract. He's paying 13 cents a kilowatt hour with a slight rate increase each year. And this, I think, is particularly amazing because if I'm the power company, and I go to the Public Utility Commission and I say, we need in contract a 25-year agreement to increase the price of electricity every single year, something like that would be very controversial. But instead, they're not going to the Public Utility Commission and proposing that as a rate structure. They're going and finding Mr. Burr who's willing to volunteer and say, well, even though most of the public thinks that that's a raw deal, I'll sign up for a 25-year contract with a slight rate increase as long as it comes from a solar array. So as long as I'm helping the local solar community, sign me up. And it says he might save between $5 and $50 over a month of the life of the contract. I disagree. We'll get into that. His major complaint was he signed up for the program and then he realized that the solar farm wasn't built yet. And so, your marketing process should be a little bit more transparent about that. And maybe there is some wisdom in what that Tennessee co-op did in terms of building the project before coming up with all of their program details. So why are they signing up these customers in advance before the projects are even built? Whereas in other cases, the projects were built first. Well, in that first case, with the co-op, they already had the power purchase agreement in place with the utility. So they already knew that someone was going to buy all of the electricity. Maybe in Minnesota's program, they need to find the buyers before they get permission to build the project. So I tracked down I tracked down a participant in the Berkshire Hathaway project and asked them a few questions. 25-year agreement. There's a termination clause. You can't just call up the utility, and if you don't like your community solar contract, you can't change your rate. It's actually a 25-year commitment, but it can terminate if you move. So if you move, you abandon the agreement. If you stay, you're committed to the agreement. And he says it's a bit of a gamble. I may save 10 grand over 25 years, or I may end up pay a little bit extra a month. Okay. I don't really see how it's so large of a spread between saving, $500 or $600 a year for 25 years versus maybe paying a little bit more money. We need to evaluate that. I asked him what happened to the Rex, and he responded, it didn't really seem like he knew what I was talking about. So I coached him a little bit, and he pulled up his contract, and he said the contract, it was photovoltaic production capacity equal to 120% of annual use. And so you're not purchasing solar power, you're purchasing solar power capacity. Okay. Uh, I guess that's how they're wordsmithing it. But it does clearly state that with regard to Rex, they're being handed over to the power company. And so I asked them, well, do you realize that if you didn't purchase the community solar development, that the power company would still have to come up with those renewable energy credits? So essentially, instead of robbing Peter to pay Paul, Peter is paying Paul's tab voluntarily. And so Paul has to pay either way. And instead of Paul paying his environmental remediation commitments, Peter is voluntarily picking up that tab. And so you could argue that, aren't you just encouraging the utility to continue with their status quo operation by subsidizing their environmental compliance? So that might, if you're like an extreme leftist, that might offend you. Well, this voluntary purchaser of energy is being much more level-headed. He says, hey, the state wants to support solar, and I want to see, I want to help encourage companies to take a chance, so why not participate in this? Basically what he said was, he didn't care about, the rate stabilization. He didn't even really care about if it ended up costing him a little bit more money to participate. He didn't care that he was picking up the utilities tab. He specifically said that compared to buying voluntary energy from the power company, he would rather spend that money to see local solar project come to his area. And he doesn't matter about, he doesn't, the politics of it all doesn't matter to him. The cost savings of it all doesn't even matter to him. It's his contract is, actually going to increase his price of electricity a little bit. He just wants to see local solar come to the grid. So I was actually very encouraged by that conversation. I tend to get a little too political sometimes, and he's reminding me that, hey, there's, Americans out there who are evaluating all of this stuff and saying that, hey, I want to help the utility out in bringing local solar to the grid, and I'm going to open up my pocketbook and give the utility some money to do it because I can't do it myself. I think that's it's very altruistic. So Minnesota passed a law that said for 1 megawatt solar arrays, and the utility would own the renewable energy credit. And what it is, it's a value of solar tariff. So in other classes, we talk about the shortcomings of net metering. Is solar electricity worth more than retail? Is it worth less than retail? What's the value of solar electricity? And the value of solar tariff is a rate that establishes the value of back-fed solar power in your state. So what is the purchase rate that the utility must purchase back-fed power on? And it can be used instead of net metering to provide a different purchase rate for utilities that is not necessarily below retail price, but is usually below retail price. Now, Minnesota's program is a little bit different. So, what it says is Minnesota's community solar gardens could be hosted on the rooftop of a commercial customer and would be backfed at the value of solar rate, which might be 11 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And what we can see is that Geronimo Energy is charging their community solar customers, 14 cents a kilowatt hour about for 20 years. And so effectively, by having a sales process that is ahead of the rate, they pass the rate, they say that this is the purchase rate for solar. That also allows the power company to go and fund the program by signing up customers who are voluntarily paying that premium rate. And so by developing these customers and going after the voluntary customers who will pay for it, there's no controversy in these projects. They're not raising money, the price of electricity on non-participants, and they're helping the power company meet all of its voluntary compliance for no additional funding. And so that's kind of considered a success, although maybe only about 1 to 2% of our population buys voluntary energy. So how much can this model scale? I don't know. One downside is, when you're talking about 20-year contracts, it may be that you actually have to stay in that location for 20 years to get any value out of it. So, what we're seeing is there are community solar programs that are participated in that will, strike a good compromise between solar power raising the cost of electricity on non-participants and the utility needing to meet compliance. How scalable it is, we'll see. What we know in Minnesota is that the current price of electricity is about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and people are voluntarily increasing their price of electricity by about 16%. And the other thing is that the price of electricity usually does not trend above inflation. Now, I think that batteries are going to be very disruptive to the price of electricity, but that's kind of a one-time event that might provide long-term cost savings down the road. And so, over a 20-year or 30-year term, the price of electricity usually does not go up that much. And so, committing to increase your electric bill by 16% today and then 2% a year thereafter, that you're going to end up losing money off of that contract compared to the regular price of electricity. And it seems like the participants in these community solar programs, they'll like to say they're going out and saving money, but maybe in the back of their minds they know that they're really just increasing their electric bill by a little bit to support a local solar project. And so in Minnesota, you see a path towards local development. You see the renewable energy credit go to the power company rather than the participant. You see voluntary funds going towards state mandated environmental compliance. you see voluntary customers willing to increase the price of their electricity and take a hit in the long run just to see local solar come out of the market. And so the point is, in Minnesota, which is considered to be a successful community solar model, the participants are not really saving any money. So what's going on? The participants are signing up for 25-year contracts in exchange for the utility doing local solar projects. So here we are in the Desire database, and we can go in and see Minnesota's solar policies. So let's bring up technology type, renewable energy, solar. Here in Minnesota, we see their net metering policy, which is being phased out and replaced with the value of solar. We see we see interconnection standards. There's a sales tax exemption, which certainly helps. We see a renewable energy standard, a community-based energy development tariff, and anything else here that, and then this value of solar tariff. And then we get into U.S. incentives. So what we see in Minnesota as regards to their net metering policy is that Minnesota already has net metering. And the net metering policy goes up to 1 megawatts commercial, 5 megawatts community solar. And there's no limit to it. And it's a month-to-month net metering program, but the credit occurs for customers at the retail rate up to 40 kilowatts. And so the utility is in a position where they have a state net metering program, and customers are buying solar in order to net meter already. And when they buy a solar array and put it on their rooftop, they already own the renewable energy credits. As far as interconnection standards go, you can interconnect solar arrays up to 10 megawatts onto the grid. Going into Minnesota's renewable portfolio standard, they have a pretty aggressive renewable energy goal where they're trying to get up to about 25% renewable over the next 3 or 4 years. So they're really being aggressive on their environmental compliance, and so you're seeing potentially large environmental compliance fees in the future. You're seeing revenue loss caused by net metering, which may increase in the future. We actually see a 4-year lifetime on renewable energy credits. We also see a tracking system for these renewable energy credits. So if I'm wondering in Minnesota, how do I go and sell my renewable energy credits? I'll look into this tracking system. Then we go in and we look at their community energy development tariff, and we say, okay, what does this look like? They say each utility in Minnesota is required to file with the Public Utility Commission a 20-year power purchase agreement for community-owned solar projects, and the rate has to be higher in the first 10 years than the last 10 years. So they're allowed essentially to have a lower rate on into the contract. And it's for projects with a rated capacity of 5 megawatts or less. And so when we see 60 megawatts distributed between 20 job sites, we see Geronimo keeping the projects to be smaller than 5 megawatts so that they qualify for this rate structure. The tariffs the utilities are required to consider the projects, but they're not required to sign the contract. So there might be some negotiation and payment that is necessary to get the utility to go along with it. And so that might be a motive to sign the customers up ahead of time voluntarily. It's because, like, if Geronimo says, look, by being first to market, we're going to take all of the voluntary customers and we're going to contract with the utility at 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and we're going to charge the customers 15 cents a kilowatt hour and just bring everybody together, and now we're a power company. And then there's rules and regulations. Half of the revenue must flow to Minnesota-based owners and other local qualifying entities. So there's a reason to increase the amount of local participation in the project. And then let's see, property owners traversed by the transmission lines must be given the opportunity to invest as well. And then finally, we get this value of solar tariff, which is essentially the same thing as the seabed tariff, but for smaller net metered projects. And the plan is it's the same rate as the T-bed tariff, but down the line, when that value is less, then they use it instead of net metering. And so what Minnesota has tried to do is create a framework that says, utilities can now do community solar, and they have the sign off on the project, but we've opened it up to private development, assuming they get utility approval. And so what's happened is the utility is now given a choice of whether or not they work with developers to develop community solar projects or allow revenue loss caused by net metering on into the future. Let's see. It is 12:17, so it's time for our morning break. Why don't we take about a 13-minute break? We're going to pick back up at 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern Time. And after we come back from break, we're actually going to head up east, and we'll look at how New York is developing community solar projects, as well as Massachusetts, a little bit differently than Minnesota. And so we're going to discuss different kinds of contractual relationships, not just one where you increase your rate, but one where you actually buy into a project. Then we'll move over to Michigan and see how they've kind of developed a hybrid approach, and take the presentation over from there. So it's 12:17. Let's take a 13-minute break. We're going to pick up at 1/2 past. We're going to pick back up again in just a minute or so. All right. Welcome back. And let's go into New York, which is another state that is getting strong behind net metering and in particular community net metering. So if you go into New York's Desire website and you look up their net metering policy, you'll see this little mention of community net metering is allowed. Um, that's something that's kind of a new take on net metering, which is community net metering or virtual net metering, essentially where the utility is taking the production from a solar array and subtracting it out between multiple electrical accounts. In fact, New York passed a law called a community net metering law that says, you know, if a project has 10 members and each subscriber are, and one individual has a demand greater than 25 kilowatts. And so what they're talking about is commercial electrical accounts or accounts that might be on demand charges, uh, where the solar array is less than uh, where the single participant who's hosting the site, their participation will be less than 40% of the total facility's output. And so, in other words, the site host that might have a good site for solar, an electric bill for solar, they could put solar on their facility and qualify it for a community net meter, but they can only own 40% of it. And they, to get that community net metered rate, they have to involve other community participants who may live nearby and not have good rooftops for solar, and that the size of the facility is limited to 2 megawatts. So, New Yorkers, they love their red tape, and so there's a few rules that they have to jump through. But the reason they might do this is maybe that community net metered rate is maybe they're a nonprofit, and so there's going to be other developers who are buying into the array and wanting to take tax incentives. Uh, maybe the community net metered rate is a higher rate than what the business would normally get on their outflowed power under a demand rate structure. Um, and so they've then there's so that's kind of a community net metering where you have multiple people buying into an array, kind of at the small scale. They also have a community solar policy that's more in line with Minnesota's community solar programs. And here's one of their vendors called Roofless Solar, where essentially they're buying a solar array and building the solar array, and then allowing individual members to buy into it. So this could be accomplished through the community solar virtual net metering plan, or otherwise they may need a value. Sorry, I guess I'm going the wrong way in the presentation. Otherwise, they need a value of solar tariff rate to net meter in. So they didn't have a lot of information on their website. I called them up and asked them how their community solar program worked, and they said that, well, the utility will credit you on your account. You buy into the array, and depending on what the compensation rate is, which is negotiated on a case by case basis. And, the closer you get into New York City, the higher electric rates go. And so, if you're building a community solar project right outside of New York City, that might have a 7 or 8 year payback. But over in Buffalo, New York, it might be more like a 15-year payback. And they said that their average payback was 11 years. And so they're taking advantage of New York's tax incentives, in addition to that community solar policy that establishes infrastructure and requirements for utilities to develop community net metering. And they're kind of organizing those projects, getting them to come out of the ground, and then managing the billing details. And so roofless solar, you get like an app, and we can see how these would violate the marketing double counting, because they're not, again, they're not explicitly telling their customers that they're going to be solar powered, but they're giving them apps and tracking and making the experience more fun, even though they're selling the RECs off to a third party. So the utility keeps the REC, and the customer essentially gets a net metered rate for 20 years, and they get a 12 and a half year simple payback. But also, there is still, between the developer and the utility, a bit of negotiation to say, okay, well, the developer could go put a 2 megawatt array on top of any building in town and turn it into a community net metered project. So then they might negotiate individually with the utility to say, well, what if we wanted to do a 20 megawatt array instead, and get something at maybe below net metering, subject to individual negotiation. So again, we pull up like the Desire website for New York. New York's going to have a bunch of different options, so let's put a few filters on: technology, renewable energy, solar technologies, photovoltaics, and their information on their net metering, and I think they have a value of solar tariff as well. What we can see is New York has a variety of residential solar tax credits: sales tax exemption, property tax exemptions, New York City sales tax exemption, green energy mandates. And I really guess I just see it for net metering, where they have net metering up to 25 kilowatts residential on up, where their net metered cost is credited to the next customer's bill at retail pricing. And then there's a couple of different ways for net metering to come. Phase one, the credits carry over indefinitely, with an allowance for community net metering, and then you use the Desire website to essentially explore the brass tacks of it. But what we see is there's a phase one community solar project, and then a phase two, and essentially New York City has. I was hoping to see it spelled out in Desire by now, but they've essentially voted in a value of solar tariff that is below the net metering value. and are transitioning towards a value of solar tariff in lieu of net metering, and that's uh, allowing developers to develop utility scale projects at the value of a solar tariff rate and virtually net meter the customer at that rate. So New York's trying to do a variety of things, but essentially you can set up a community solar project through their net metering policy at this time for arrays that are limited to 2 megawatts in size. So then we're going to come back to the New York economics. But we also want to show Massachusetts because it's kind of similar to New York in that both New York and Massachusetts, you may look at the array and think 11 to 12-year payback. That's the payback for solar in most of the country where you're like super managing your project and getting your costs down as much as possible. So some customers will look at an 11 or 12-year payback and think, well, if I don't have to do any maintenance, that's actually a pretty good deal, and I'm going to go for it. But in Massachusetts, the community solar project is even better. All you need to do is call up a community solar company and say, I'm going to switch over to you guys, and you immediately get 5 to 10% off of your electric bill. So quite literally, you just pick up your phone, switch to community solar, and you start saving money immediately. How does that work? In Minnesota, to participate in community solar, you're increasing your bill. In Massachusetts, to participate in community solar, you're decreasing the bill. And for that, we have to go back to the price of those renewable energy credits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a website called srectrade.com. And they're an example of, I've never used these guys. I don't do this kind of utility incentive rec sales, but I like their website. They've been in it for a while, and they'll publish, their rec pricing. So this is an example of if you live in a market where you can sell your recs, you would go and register with them. They're called a rec aggregator, and the rec aggregator would sell the recs on your behalf for a transaction fee. And so you can kind of see what markets they service, these are kind of the states that have the most, high valued recs. And let's go into Massachusetts and see what their rec price is. Now, so here's Massachusetts. And we can see that in the past, their rec prices have been pretty high, but now they're still pretty high. So in August of 2017, so this past month, renewable energy credits have sold for as much as $305 or 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And the price of electricity in Massachusetts is around 17 cents a kilowatt hour. And so what that means is that the value of the rec is almost twice as much as the value of the electricity itself. And we can see that in New Jersey. I've followed the New Jersey rec markets for some time, and I'm still shocked to see that they're up in the 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt range. They used to be higher than this, but they have maintained their value a lot more than I suspected. So, and some of that is because the requirements are getting more stringent each year too on how much solar generation you need to participate, again, at the state level. So then we go into another market like Ohio, and we see that the recs are selling for $3.50 rather than $200. It just depends on your state policy. And so what that means to our presentation is that in Massachusetts, there's not just the value of the electricity that you get, but also the renewable energy credit, and the developer of the program keeps the renewable energy credit and sells it. And so, not to say that that's a bad thing, but compared to solar ownership, by participating in community solar, you're getting what, a generation rate that is effectively uh, below retail value if you participate. But if you actually go and buy a solar array, you might have a solar array that generates at 3 times that amount. And so, in order to kind of get the interconnection agreements for these larger projects, you'll have a company like Solar Perks signing up all the customers, and so that when they go and apply for an offsite solar array with their interconnection agreement for a large utility solar farm, it strengthens their application with the utility if they have customers signed up in advance. Just think about it like on a deregulated market. If you want to plug a new power plant into that grid and start selling electricity, it's good to have customers to buy that electricity. And so here they're able to attract customers by saying, we're going to give you a discount on your existing electric bill, get their larger utility scale projects pushed through because they have the customers to offtake that electricity, and they get to make their money off of the renewable energy credit sale. And so in these projects, we see either like roofless solar in New York, where you can buy actually into the array and receive money off of your bill. Then again, we see in Minnesota's program, you're not actually buying into the bill, you're buying the energy from the array on the other side of it, and you're actually spending more money rather than less money. Then we see in Massachusetts, you're not buying into the array, you're essentially buying the electricity from the array at a discount. You're not keeping the renewable energy credit. So in all those situations, we have a choice between buying into the array up front and receiving some cost savings down the line, or we might not buy the array and just sign up for a solar specific rate program, and that may or may not increase our electric bill. It may decrease our electric bill in markets where the value of solar electricity is very high, and it may increase our electric bill where the value of solar is not so much. And so what Michigan has done is tried to simplify that process by saying you can purchase certain blocks of array. You're not buying solar power, you're not buying production capacity, you're buying blocks. And the blocks are, it's kind of like an annuity in the sense. You buy the block of solar and you receive so much cost savings a month. And so here in Michigan, one block of solar is equal to 500 kilowatts of solar panel capacity. And by buying that block, you get a credit on your bill for 25 years. But then so this looks like a program that they're purchasing into and then receiving a credit over time, but they're also offering it in 3 different ways. You can either buy the block of solar upfront, or you can finance it over a period of 3 years, or finance it over a period of 7 years, or finance it over a period of 25 years. And by the time you get to the 25-year financing plan, effectively, you're just increasing the price of your electric bill by about $10 a month. Whereas if you go for the lump sum option, you may end up getting your money back. So let's break down the cost. You're spending $1,289 on a 500 watt block of solar power. And you don't get the federal tax credit on that. That's the developers claiming the tax credit. So let's back out the value of the tax credit and say, okay, if you put solar on your own rooftop for $3.60 a watt in Michigan, that would be equivalent to what the buy-in price is for community solar participation. And now in Michigan, the average cost of solar is more on the $3 a watt range than the $4 a watt range. So it's like if you buy kind of a premium priced solar array, then it's kind of compared to that. And is that fair? I don't know. You're not having to maintain the system for one, so maybe. Well, let's see how the price turns out. If you finance it for $10 a month, and we go and we do our PV watts calculations, so we can actually use PV watts in Michigan to determine, how much 500 watts of electricity will produce per year. It's about 50 kilowatt hours a month. And so, $10 a month, 50 kilowatt hours a month, that turns out to be about 19 cents per kilowatt hour. And the price of electricity in Michigan is 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you go for the $10 a month, 25-year financing plan, you're effectively increasing the price of your electricity by 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's a pretty expensive proposition. Now, if you spend $3.60 a month and you're generating, let me pull up my calculator here. If you spend $3.60 a watt on solar and then you get the federal tax credit of 30%, your total buy-in at $2.52 a watt, and let's say your solar array produces 1.3 kilowatt hours per year. If your electric rate is 15 cents a kilowatt hour, 252 a watt divided by 1.3 kilowatt hours per watt per year from PV watts divided by 15 cents a kilowatt hour, the simple payback on this array, if you buy up front, is 13 years. And so if you take the upfront purchase option, you have a 13-year payback on your array. If you take the financing option, you're increasing your electricity by 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And so, they're trying to kind of split the middle. They know that there's some customers who are going to want to buy into the array and tell themselves that, if they ignore the cost of capital, if they're not really treating solar like an investment, but something that they just want to do, they buy in and they get their money back 13 or 14 years into the process. And if they move out in the time being, then they don't get their money back, and the utility actually makes a little bit more money off of it like that. And then if they are the type of customer who doesn't want to buy into the array but just wants to sign up for community solar energy, they just increase their electric bill by $10 a month, and effectively that's getting a voluntary customer to agree to a substantial rate hike in their electric bill. So what value does this offer the customer? Well, the value is the customer gets to feel like they are helping local solar development. And there's enough of those customers out there who want to just voluntarily contribute money into the system that it'll actually result in one of two things. It'll either result in the utility buying a large array for $1 or $1.50 a watt and being able to sell it for $3.60 a watt. And so they're making money off of the install of the project instead of the solar installer. So finally, the utility can start directly competing with the solar installer for project development. Or alternately, the utility is getting customers committing to long-term contracts at a premium electric rate. Both options are, good options for the utility, especially if the alternative is net metering. And what's kind of unique about Michigan's program is they actually go all the way through and say, Well, some of this is that we're giving the renewable energy credit to the customer. And while there is not a huge renewable energy credit market in Michigan, if the customer wants to, they can go and sell that renewable energy credit. So if they can find a buyer for the REC, then their participation really isn't going to cost them as much money, or they might be able to get a quicker payback. So, that's kind of nice that they're making money off the solar project. They don't need the RECs for environmental compliance purposes. And so, while the margins are not the best for the customer gets the REC, which means they can claim compliance or they can try and go and sell their REC. And then so what we're seeing is this subscription block model where they're buying photovoltaic production capacity that is actually similar to the to the Geronimo rate where you pay up front, but they've also combined the pay up front model with a pay as you go model. And then another model that is slightly different is Bark, Virginia, where they built a community solar array, and their participants can sign up for $5 a month. And again, they're referring to a block of solar energy, but instead of the block being array capacity, the block is the energy capacity. So each block is 50 kilowatt hours, and you're buying a block for $5. And so 20 blocks would be a megawatt hour. Effectively, your 20 times 5 is $100. And normally the block would cost, for that 50 kilowatt hours, it would cost $4 instead of $5. So they're effectively creating a value of a $20 REC, which is easier if we actually look at the Bark electric bill and see what's going on in this graphic. So here we have a customer using 1,300 kilowatt hours of electricity, and 1,200 of those kilowatt hours is charged at 1,200. It's charged at $102. So it's at about 8 cents a kilowatt hour for this block. And then we get 2 blocks of community solar, which is $100, 100 kilowatt hours at $10. So instead of being $102 divided by 12, or $100 divided by 12, about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Instead, they've raised the price of electricity to $10 divided by 100. Instead of paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity, now they're paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity. And so that implies a 2 cent a kilowatt hour premium. And so effectively what's happening is they're selling $5 a month of electricity, where $4 a month is the exact same electricity and $1 of that cost is the REC, implying about a 2 cent a kilowatt hour value of the solar REC. And knowing what utilities value solar RECs at is important. You may just find that you have RECs and you have nothing to do with them. And what do you do with your RECs? Well, you could donate them to a nonprofit if you wanted to, but what good does that do you? The value of the tax write-off for REC donation, you might need a handshake agreement from another provider. And so if you live in Virginia, Bark is establishing a market for $20 solar RECs, and you might be able to squeeze an additional value out of your array by, nonprofit donations or something like that. And there's a YouTube link if you want to see more about their program detail. And so what we're seeing in Virginia is that they're selling the energy from the array. In Michigan, we're seeing that they're selling the production capacity. In Massachusetts, it's the energy from the array. In New York, it's the production capacity. In Minnesota, it's really the energy from the array. You can either buy energy at a premium, or you can buy into the project and get a credit. What we're seeing out of all of these programs is the participants themselves want to participate in community solar without a clear financial motive. And that actually has become very important because there's concern about, well, if I set up a community solar program in the private market, is what I'm essentially doing setting up an investment vehicle or a financial security? If you buy into, what's the difference between putting $10,000 into solar blocks that pay an annual return versus $10,000 into the stock market or an annuity fund that pays an annual return? And the difference is that solar project may not be regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission, unlike the stock market. And so there's a concern about, well, do I need to register my community solar array with the SEC in order to sell a community solar project? And so far, the tax guidance has actually come back and said, well, we would not consider the participants in community solar to be investors. In other words, that the return on investment for community solar participation is so low that it's not considered an investment and therefore not subject to regulation by the SEC, which is, that is a good answer for now. But if if we want to create a community solar program that is a good investment, I could see the SEC reversing their position on that. We see community solar as a way to raise voluntary funds for state mandates. We see community solar as a way to bring solar capacity to the grid, and that doesn't necessarily increase demand. So at the end of the day, if your supply is greater than demand, maybe community solar is actually helping the price of electricity stay low. We see it as a way for the utility to profit off of the difference between the sales price and the hard construction cost, or for utilities to secure contracts, long-term contracts with their residential consumers, and get them to agree to rate hikes, which is normally a very difficult discussion. And so there is a bit of robbing the community solar member to pay robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Peter is all right with that because they just want to see local solar come to the grid. And we also see community solar projects kind of watering down the current standards on double counting of renewable energy credits. And because there's no alarm bells ringing off, and in fact, in most cases, it's the state that is coming in and saying, no, this is our policy. In order to do virtual net metering, in order to make community net metering work, we have to give some value to the utility. And so, that relationship may be subject to utility approval, or it may be a utility mandate to provide these rate structures, but they're still throwing the utility a bone saying, by doing this, you get environmental compliance for no cost. And so when that comes into, well, how do we design a community solar project for ourselves, then we have a few options. We have a subscriber block model that utilities are using because it's just easier for a customer to understand that their community solar participation could be itemized down to a $5 or $10 chunk on their electric bill, or instead of buying they're offered a buy-in rate at 500 watts or 1,000 watts or 1,500 watts into the project. There's also a way to design a community solar program not using any kind of like terms of buying into the array, but simply through doing creative lease structures where you might own the equipment, but you might sign an operating lease so that the community solar participant is actually owning the array for under a 20-year lease agreement and then returning the array back to you. And the lease arrangements are usually common if the like buy-in block model of long-term ownership would be considered regulated by the SEC. It's the same way where many states will consider if you own power generation technology and you're selling electricity to the customer, that makes you a utility, whereas Solar City's model would in those states might not be to tie the payments of the array equal to the electricity produced, but instead give you a fixed lease payment so that you can use the equipment. But since I made these slides, there's been some IRS guidance on not regulating community solar as an investment vehicle for now, simply because most community solar programs in the country are not in the financial best interest of the participant, but the participant is all right with that. And so under the subscription block model, you can have uh, uh, savings as much as 10% off your bill, as we've seen in Massachusetts, or you're actually increasing your rate by as much as 20%, as we see on other grids. And we've talked about the advantages of that already. You could also have a lease agreement. This is where the utility has a leg up on community solar development, is that they already have the relationships in place with their customers, and they already have all the electrical accounts set up with their customers. So even though we like to complain about our electric bills and electric utilities, we still view them as an institute of trust. To give you a counter example of a community solar program that isn't using the utility at all, what we're going to go to is a vendor called Arcadia Power. And they sell renewable energy credits, and they also have this community solar platform, which is a pretty developed private industry sales platform. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but what we can see is they have a couple of community solar projects going on. And what we can see is they're in DC and Massachusetts and New Jersey, and all of these markets have renewable energy credit value. And so right now in the New Jersey project, you can buy in for $100. It doesn't matter where you are, and you buy in for $100, and you get little, cell phone apps, and they actually do something pretty cool, which is they'll take your utility account payment information and they'll pay your electric bill and then credit you with the money that's returned from your community solar program, and then send you a Arcadia Power bill. So it feels like you're getting your electric bill each month, and it's a solar power electric bill. They're actually just paying your bill and then sending you a different bill. It's a little bit easier that way on the customer. But what you can see is that they're essentially taking solar arrays that are already on rooftops and saying, look, this is a solar array that you can buy into instead. And why would you do that? Well, you may be a commercial developer and you're not in it for the long-term gain. You may want to build an array and then cash yourself out and let other people participate in the long term. And now with micro investing, We can get individuals looking for community solar projects to participate in to foot the tab. And so when I called up Arcadia Power to ask them about the economics of their programs, effectively what the return is on their arrays is if you go and you spend $100 to participate in this community solar project, over 7 years, you only get like $130 back. It essentially equates into a near 0% interest loan for 7 years. And you're assuming all the risk that over a 7-year term, that the project doesn't go under, that Arcadia Power doesn't go under. It's a very risky investment for almost no return on investment. But then again, there are places in the country where solar does not offer a very good return on investment. And so what are you to do? Are you going to go spend $20,000 to put a solar array on your rooftop in Alabama, which has very anti-solar policy, and you might get a 15 or 16-year payback? Or are you going to give this project $100 and you'll get your money back in 7 years, and it's really not costing you any money really, but you feel like you're helping the environment? So what Arcadia Power is banking on is that there's a more profitable project in New Jersey, and that they can get customers in Alabama to provide the financing at a very low interest rate. And if it works for the private market, it should work for utilities as well, especially when they don't have to do any sales and marketing. They can just promote it out to their existing members. So there is an advantage to having the utility on board. So you might have, in a utility public-private partnership, you might have the utility receiving the RECs and administering the credits on the customer bills. And in exchange for that, they might charge the developer fees in order to lose profit from net metering, depending on if the values, if the RECs are worth a lot of money, they might not charge any fees. If the RECs are worthless, they might have to charge the developer and somewhat split the profit made off of the development. Whereas the developer might identify the land, provide the maintenance, insurance, and operability, and take on the liability and the tax appetite of the project. Utilities usually will not have huge tax appetites. So let's say I do, and this is a little out of date. Let's just assume that I do a solar install for $250 a watt. And that might be a utility scale pilot project, like a 500 kilowatt ground mount or something like that. The developer would own it, take the tax credit, so now it's down to $1.75 a watt. And let's say we go and we in Minnesota's program, we sign up customers who are buying that electricity at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and let's just say 2 cents is going into operating expenses. We look at our PV watts production from Minnesota, 12 cents a kilowatt hour, 1.4 kilowatt hours a year, 17 cents per watt hour per year, divided by $1.75, or $1.75 a watt divided by 17 cents per watt per year, turns out to be about an 11-year payback, a 7% internal rate of return, a profitable net present value. And so whoever brings that to market is going to make some profit off of this. And if they can get the install costs down even lower, all the more profitability. Or you could sell your ownership stake, because this assumes you're going to have to own the project for 11 plus years. You may find a buyer who is fine with not an 11-year payback, but a 13 or 14-year payback. And you might sell your ownership stake to them and cash out early. So what the public-private partnership can kind of give the utility is free renewable energy credits, the ability to charge the developer about 2 cents a kilowatt hour for administrative fees. The developer still makes some money. These are, it's not like the stock market in days past where you're getting 8% a year or more after taxes. This is a lower interest investment that's also a little bit more stable because you have the utility there saying we'll honor the contracts. It encourages local solar development and helps the utility kind of stay involved as they lose revenue due to solar. And some of it is they can portray themselves as the good guys. States that are behind the ball in terms of solar policy, states that want to roll back net metering, the utility must do some projects to say, we're not doing net metering, but we're doing projects our own way. And so there is some self-interest in the utilities getting involved in this game. Uh, it may be a little bit easier to just keep things simple and say, okay, well, I don't know anything about solar or power purchase agreements, but my accountant knows all about equipment operating leases because you may be leasing some capital equipment like forklifts or fleet vehicles. And so you go and ask your financial planner or CPA to draw up a power purchase agreement with the utility. They may say, we don't know what you're talking about. But if you ask them, hey, can you evaluate this equipment operating lease agreement to see if the terms and conditions are right, they remember, oh, equipment operating leases, operating leases are different than capital leases. They abide by different rules. Um, so you may have to choose on, do you want to do operating leases or capital leases? Um, and there's legal considerations. If you build the solar array and it's already built and you're offering people buy-ins, the concern has been stock, financial regulatory issues. Is that the same as soliciting a non-qualified investor for investment in my business? Because it's essentially doing the same thing. And so to kind of get out, ahead of the IRS stepping in and saying we're not really looking at community solar projects as being investment vehicles at this time for the participant. You could look at operating leases versus capital leases. The difference being a capital lease is one of those leases where at the end of the term you can buy the asset for $1. And essentially, whoever's the leasee is considered the owner in a capital lease. So if a capital lease is essentially a loan where you own the asset at the end of the loan term, you take the tax credit, you take the depreciation, whereas an operating lease, the asset is returned to the operator at the end of the lease. So at the end of a Solar City contract, you have to renegotiate a new power purchase agreement or they come and take the array off your roof. In an operating lease, the lessor, the original asset owner, retains the tax credits and depreciation, but the participant does not. And so if you wanted to develop a community solar arrangement for a church, instead of going to the utility, you could form an operating leasing company with a number of church members, and you all own your sections of the operating lease, and the tax credits would flow out to the individual members, but the church is used as the job site, and maybe the operating lease company drafts a sweetheart deal with the church so that they're buying the electricity at below retail price. And that way the owners get to keep the tax credits and incentives, and the church gets a solar array and a discount. Alternately, you may be a developer and you may not have the tax liability to use. And you may want your participants to be able to claim the taxes and tax incentives, at which point you should be looking at, say, a capital lease rather than an operating lease. And that's stuff that a certified accountant can, like your CPA, can help you figure out. And so we've proposed community solar programs where the TVA was providing a power purchase agreement, like a feed-in tariff for large project developers. Well, now they come back and say, well, you need to add a community solar platform to the project in order to get this PPA. And so now we have to add an additional layer to the project in order to comply with the TVA regulation. But it doesn't need to be all that complicated. Your CPA is probably familiar with sale leaseback arrangements. And so what you might have is like in Middleburg Electric Cooperative, where you might have an investor underwrite the project, but then as community solar members want to buy in and participate, they're effectively cashing out the investor early, which is usually in the best interest of the project developer to remove or alleviate some financial liability from the project. Which was actually kind of an eye-opening experience. Ultimately, this did not get out of the ground. Our local electric cooperative said, well, we just don't have the legal resources to evaluate the TVA's program, so we can't participate in it, which was very disappointing. But originally, we went into this looking at it as the TVA is forcing us to do community solar. And then by the end of the application process, we were actually quite excited to be able to offer community solar because we realized that it was in the best interest of the investor to do so. And so depending on if there's a rec market, and depending on whether or not it's a regulated or deregulated grid, there may be the ability to monetize the RECs. If there's no REC market, you may just return the RECs to the customers and avoid the double counting issues. If your utility has a streamlined process, you may work with them and pay them an administrative fee to administer the virtual net metering program. If there is no platform to work with the utility on, you may develop your own arrangement where you have a lease agreement between yourself and the site host, and the revenue is coming from that site host in the net metering arrangement, and then you administer either down payments with payments being returned to the participants, or you just sign up the participants for the solar electricity, and they're making payments to you, and you're delivering them renewable energy credits from that job site effectively. So hopefully now we have an understanding of different building blocks of the community solar process, and we understand that the participants are not necessarily the ones who make the profit, but it's the developers and the utilities who have the most interest in driving community solar to market. And that's also why we saw community solar being the next era of industry growth when the tax credit went away, to say like this combines economies of scale with the ability for the utility to do this instead of net metering or instead of REC compliance. If you actually make it so far into developing a large-scale project, what's common is for the developer not to retain ownership of the project, but instead to bring on a tax investor. And as opposed to tax credits given to the housing market, the energy investment tax credits cannot be bought and resold to third parties. So you have to have if you can't claim the taxes yourself, you have to have the ability for someone to come in and offload the taxes. And if you want to do it just simply under sale leaseback arrangements with an S corp, those tax credits are going to be divided up amongst the investors in proportion to their relative, project ownership. Well, it still might be that the developer still doesn't have a lot of tax liability, and really, who has the tax liabilities in this country are your technology companies like Google and your investment banks like Berkshire Hathaway. And so we see these hedge funds being created to finance community solar because, instead of buying bonds at 1 or 2%, they'll finance community solar projects at 5%, make a lot more money for slightly more risk. And so I can't really understand how an inverted lease structure works, but it's a very common structure for these developers to build the project, sign the customers up, and then transfer ownership to a tax equity investor for a number of years so that the tax equity investor claims the tax credit and depreciation and then later gives the control back to the developer. So while I don't quite understand legally why this is possible, it's very common to see, say we saw Geronimo Energy develop the project, but then when they're ready for the community solar marketing and layer to be added to it, it's Berkshire Hathaway that signs the customers up because they're coming in right after the project is built to own the array for tax purposes. So for the last bit of the program, what I want to look at is tracking arrays. Tracking has really come on strong in the solar industry, and I want to spend some time experimenting with PV watts to kind of dispel a few notions about tracking. The first is we're going to do a PV watts calculation, and right here in PV watts, where you can pick array type, that's like a ground mount or a roof mount. You can also pick a tracking array. So you can actually go and model tracking in PV watts. And what we see up in Minneapolis is a 25% increase in production out of a panel because of just east-west tracking. Now, this is tracking that's not going to face the modules north in the winter and a shallower tilt in the summertime. Instead, the module is flat at noon and facing east in the morning and facing west in the evening. And the reason for that is now you can have one drive that's driving all the modules in like a big 350 kilowatt block. When I got in the solar industry in 2008 and 2009, the price of solar was beginning to drop. And so the conventional wisdom was, rather than have tracking, just take the money you would spend on the tracker and, add more modules and get that extra 25% production by adding more modules because now solar modules are cheap. And that was for the most part true. But what that didn't include was that there was no like giant utility scale tracking out there. I mean, the Nellis Air Force Base had a double axis tracker on it, and that was built as a pilot project, over maybe 2 decades ago. But that doesn't mean that tracking was commercially viable. That was an experimental project. But now, even though the modules are cheap, they're looking at, well, how can we squeeze more power out of our field? And tracking will you have to space the modules further apart, but you gain energy density from tracking. Also, the value of the electricity is higher because, if solar is fixed at a 30-degree angle, we talk in other classes that produces a lot of electricity in the spring and fall when you don't need it. A tracking array is great for the summertime. It's great for morning sun. It's great for evening sun. It's great in the summertime when electricity costs are high. But also on those snowy, overcast days, the module's facing straight up, and on an overcast day, light is diffuse. It's not direct. And so you capture more diffuse light when the module is facing straight up in the air than when it's tilted, which means even on overcast winter days when electric use might be high because of heat, you're getting more out of your array than if it was tilted up at a steeper angle. And so there are time-based values and seasonal-based values of being able to move the modules around that are independent of the module cost. It's just that these utility scale trackers were not being manufactured, and now they are. And so, essentially, wherever there is a flat field that you can drive a pile into, and these piles, it's like for every foot out of the ground they go, you're going a foot down in kind of clay, sandy soils. The problem becomes when you're with tracking is when your terrain is on a hillside, when it's not even, or when you, like in Maine, where you have big granite boulders underneath the soil and you just can't drive the piles down. What you need for a tracking array is a relatively flat piece of land that you can drive piles into. And that's not all job sites. But where you can do tracking, this tracker costs about 18 cents a watt, whereas a normally fixed in place tracker would cost, or fixed in place racking system would cost maybe 12 or 13 cents a watt. Now, so your tracker is going to increase your project cost maybe by 5 or 6 cents per watt, and then there's some additional site preparation work in it. So let's just say your tracking increases your utility scale project cost by 10 to 20 cents per watt. Utility scale projects are being installed for between $1 and $1.50, which means that your tracking project will raise your cost anywhere between 8 to 20%. And there's many regions where the boost in your performance, Minnesota's all the way up at the top of the United States. You might think that east-west tracking wouldn't make sense. Where east-west tracking is better for the equator and north-south tracking is better the further up, your latitude you get. Well, that's just not true. In the summertime, the sun's up more than south. And so east-west tracking will boost your performance by 25% for maybe for the right project, a 10% increase in cost. That's worthwhile. Almost ironically, even though Houston, Texas is much closer to the equator, you get less of a performance boost out of it. And some of that is it's so hot in the summertime in Houston and it's so humid in the summertime in Houston that the gained increase in the summertime is somewhat offset by the heat and the humidity diffusing summertime sun. But also it's a matter of weather. In Houston, you don't really get overcast, cloudy winters. And so your solar array is on in the wintertime. Whereas in Minnesota, you do get those overcast, cloudy winters, so the array is off a lot in the wintertime, or by off, I mean at way under capacity. And so there is a little bit of a kick by enabling, a more summertime oriented array tilt angle in Minnesota, whereas in Houston, if you go more towards summer, you lose a lot more in winter. Whereas in Minnesota, you go towards summer, you're not losing so much in winter because there's not much winter production to begin with. So, throughout the entire country, a tracker, a east-west horizontal tracker can add value, not just in the southern part of the United States. About the only place in the country where tracking doesn't make a lot of sense is like Seattle, where it's just cloudy all day long. You only see a very modest boost in production from tracking. Phoenix, Arizona, 24% increase. I mean, you can go into PV watts and model it. I guess it's going a little slow. So here we are in Kansas City, Kansas, and after selecting our weather station, we can go into this array type, and it'll go through what the inputs are. You can actually model single axis and double axis tracking for a tilted up array. But what we have to remember, if we're doing a horizontal axis tracker, you start with a tilt angle that's 0, would be what most systems are. There's also a feature on some horizontal axis trackers called backtracking, and backtracking is when you tilt the module up, it's going to cast a longer shadow. So some of your trackers have independent drives on each row of the module, so that the modules can kind of adjust themselves when the shadows start to, the row to row shadows start to inhibit production loss. So we talked about soil types. In terms of where, if you want to do a community solar project, maybe that's a reason to do multiple string inverters instead of one big central inverter. I'm a fan of one big central inverter, having done commercial projects with a bunch of string inverters. There's just too much wiring work when you start getting into dozens of string inverters, and having just one big honking inverter for the entire system is is less work. But with string inverters, you'll get one monitor per inverter instead of one monitor for the entire system. So maybe your community solar participants come in and buy, an inverter's worth of modules, and you can set them up with their own unique accounts that way. And also now at the utility level, just like we have micro inverters for the residential level, there's micro inverters for utility scale string arrays, where you might put one optimizer on every 2 strings instead of behind every single module. And so that could give you a monitoring point as well if you actually wanted to take the next step into virtual integration and actually show the customer exactly which modules they're buying into and how much energy they're supporting. That's not usually how it plays out. Usually the electricity is kind of commonly pooled and then reallocated. So what have we talked about? Well, we have Massachusetts ownership, where the buy-in is equivalently, let's say you're buying the array at $350 a watt, you get the tax credit at $245 a watt, your electricity is 18 cents a kilowatt hour, and let's just assume the REC price sticks around for 4 years at 27 cents a kilowatt hour. What that means is, for a solar array in Massachusetts, is that you're going to get a 4-year payback on a solar array. Or you could go and sign up for the community solar bill and get a 10% discount immediately. And so getting that 10% discount is a great incentive, but the value of solar direct ownership is much, much more. And so I hope the utility is charging these utility scale community solar arrays a lot of money, because otherwise that money is maybe just leaving the state and going into those hedge funds that are financially backing the arrays. In Minnesota, if you look at a 350 watt install cost, their price of electricity is a lot smaller, and they don't really have a rec value. Production's a little bit better, but that lower install rate means you have a 14-year payback. And their community solar projects essentially increase the bill rather than decrease the bill. And so what we see is like Massachusetts has a financially advantageous community solar project, but ownership is a really good deal. In Minnesota, the community solar programs are not really financially advantageous, but direct ownership is also not that great of a deal either. And I think that pretty much sums it up. You know, community solar in markets where direct solar ownership is not very good, community solar is not going to have anything more than offering a better product for voluntary customers. And voluntary customers may be 1 to 2% of the population. And so by offering a better product, maybe we get more voluntary customers, and maybe that's enough to grow solar to be 2 or 3% of your state's solar capacity by itself. In markets where solar is a much better, ownership value, you may see even larger rates of participation. But for, the middle of the United States, I don't see community solar being anything more than a replacement of voluntary green energy transactions. But that's still a market in most of those states. I think like Mississippi right now, our solar is still at around 0.1% of the state's energy use, and we could use more options here. There are recognitions you can get for being a green company. You can be a registered EPA Green Power partner. It's a free program to participate in, and you can qualify for it by just buying renewable energy credits. You don't have to do community solar. So you can source your RECs directly. I've looked into that market, and you can buy RECs for as cheap as $1 a megawatt hour on open markets. There's the Solarize movement where they try and network multiple people together for group purchasing to get discounts. And even some of your solar finance companies in the past, Solar City, Sunrun, have offered corporate bonds to help finance solar projects, but those are pretty risky too. They're much more risky than a municipal bond. And so what I'm looking at now is a different solar platform called SolarCoin, which is a solar cryptocurrency. And this didn't make it into the program. This is kind of a new effort. So I'm going to pull that up and show you what SolarCoin looks like. So let me open up my wallet. I have to enter in my solar. Hold on one sec. So here is I'm interested in how to develop your own private internal community solar platforms. And what the SolarCoin is a digital cryptocurrency. Let's just call it a tracking system for lack of a better term. And going into my account, I have a couple of accounts set up. Let's see, I can't zoom in on this. But what I have is a insurance pool, an investor, a site host, and a program administrator. And we all have individual accounts within this software. And basically what you can do with cryptocurrencies is develop private applications for them. So let me go into my settings, and go into my command console, this is actually for the computer nerds. You have all these, I can't make them any larger, but I have all these command lines for ways that I can manipulate and set up, programs for my individual Solar Coin account. And you don't need to use Solar Coin for this. This is something that there's a lot of energy coins on the market. But basically, you can use Solar Coin right now to create lists of accounts and develop software programs to track the electrons that get logged to the account, and then the electrons that get allocated amongst the investors, site hosts, and program administrator funds. Um, in other words, there are computer softwares out there now. What I like Solar Coin because it actually takes the inverter monitoring from your solar inverters and auto logs it into the platform. So for inverters that have open access, API access to their monitoring systems, you could set up your own exchange where the inverters are actually reporting the data, automatically logging it to the internet. And as an account administrator, all you need to worry about is allocating the electrons appropriately so that you can develop your invoicing and procedures. And the advantage of this is that in a blockchain, right now we have to rely upon our utility to stay honest with those ledgers to make sure that they're just not, that they're actually delivering a community solar program and not just claiming to deliver one. But with a blockchain, I can actually go onto the blockchain and look at my zip code and find blockchain transactions that have occurred in my region. So like when I did this transaction, I logged my address to it, and now anyone can go and search the solar blockchain and find my address. And this offers not just potential for renewable energy credit sales, but also community solar platforms as well, for your own internal. And again, it's not just Solar Coin. There's energy coin, there's kilowatt hour coin. There's a lot of startups in this market who are trying to develop energy coin digital currencies for tracking these kinds of programs. So anyway, that's really all I have to say on community solar. We still have some time left in the program, though. So this is kind of a rare occasion where we have time for questions. So for the audience members who are here in class today, so Neil, Joffrey, Ronald, if y'all have questions about your utility or your own community solar programs in your area or your state policy, this is a great time to ask them through the chat block, or we could turn on your microphone if you request me to. So, do you have any questions about community solar in your area? Have we hit on the talking points, or is there a topic that you would like me to cover in more detail? You can go and model double axis tracking in PV watts. And so, we do a single axis tracking in Kansas City. 17,300 kilowatt hours per year. And then we go to double axis tracking, 1,900. So we do see an uptick from single axis to double axis tracking, but it's not as significant as the uptick between no tracking to single axis tracking. So we gained 300 kilowatt hours by going to a single axis tracker, and then going from a single axis tracker to a double axis tracker, we only gained 200 kilowatt hours. And You go and look at the models for your double axis trackers. Um, And what you can tell is these double axis trackers, they take up more space. There's a lot more empty space on a double axis tracker because of your inter-row spacing for self-shading becomes an issue. So, the models for tracking that have really come into play, this is a double axis tracker is very complicated to enforce. And maybe on a military base, there's a reason for double axis tracking. For off grid arrays, double axis tracking makes sense because anything you can do to take energy off of that battery bank is a good thing. So maybe for off-grid markets, double axis trackers could work. Um, or let's just Google utility scale solar tracker. And what we see in the Google image search is while there are some kind of unique designs out there, by and large, what we actually see in the field and not some kind of photoshopped picture, but projects that are actually being implemented are on these single axis trackers on perfectly flat pieces of land. And what's nice about the single axis trackers is the modules, when you're installing them, they're just waist height. There's a lot more earthwork you need to do, but as far as the crew goes, you're not up on ladders. The stuff isn't inaccessible. They're kind of a delight to install if you're used to being up on a rooftop or up on a ladder when you're bolting the stuff together. Uh, we're still going to keep going for about 5 more minutes before we put you into the quiz. So, if you have any general solar questions, you've probably been through. Uh, yeah, so Joffrey has a question. Have I worked on any airport projects? Do you have any issues such as glare or frangibility of the grids? Um, I've never come across any instance of an airplane's landing gear getting messed up. The concern is not really for commercial aircraft. I mean, glare would be a concern, but with airports and reflectivity, it's more on your smaller model airplanes that might have some guidance systems for landing that would be impacted by the reflectivity off of a solar module that might be directly facing, being, I guess, kind of directly lining the runway. So you wouldn't want to point the modules in the same direction that the planes are approaching from on that runway. But I have never worked on any airport projects, so I don't know other than that the planning involved. Other than you do have to get an FAA clearance for a solar project near an airport, and there are solar projects near airports. Indianapolis has one, Austin, Texas has one. I think in Hawaii there are solar arrays near airports as well. So I haven't seen it be an issue, but I would think it might be more of an issue on regional airports and hobbyist airports where you have older style aircraft planes that might have like some infrared guidance systems for their for landing assistance. So I can't really speak to that too much other than no, and you need to look into it when you're building airport arrays. Where I hear glare issues being more common is on mountainside communities where your solar array might be reflecting light and heat onto your neighbor's vinyl siding further up the mountain. And there have been reports of modules kind of melting or degrading a neighbor's vinyl siding because of glare. And I don't know a great design software for modeling that. those are kind of issues that should be obvious. Don't point the modules directly at the airplanes when they're trying to land, and don't you'll see when you're melting your neighbor's building wall where it's coming from, where the heat is coming from. But to the designer at the front end who isn't kind of looking around and is just looking at the rooftop, those issues can be mixed. As far as purchasing volumes go, the largest utility scale tracker companies like ATI will generally only sell to projects 2 megawatts and up. Although some of your smaller competitors like Game Change Racking will go down into lower purchase quantities. Kind of the minimal tracking block is about 350 kilowatts of solar. And so I haven't seen, not that you can't buy, so you really have to be planning larger commercial ground mounts and utility scale ground mounts before you get into tracking, unless you're doing an off-grid residential, at which point buying a higher priced off-grid residential tracking may make some sense. On our off-grid home, we're not doing tracking, mainly because we are doing a roof mount array, and it doesn't make sense to do any kind of tracking up on the roof. It's just better to stay coplanar to the roof. All right. Well, this is a little bit of a shorter program than most. So why don't we get you guys? We've been at it for 3 hours. We do have a quiz. So why don't we get you guys into the quiz? I'm kind of out of content to say, and I don't have any more questions. So, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Half Moon, and they'll be able to take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Cromer, and everyone else in attendance. I want to remind everyone to take the quiz after the webinar ends if you need continuing education credit for this webinar. Certificates will be emailed in PDF form, and if you have any questions, you can reply to any email that you've received regarding this webinar or simply call into our office. And here's your quiz, and have a nice day.